Things my wife and I wanted to do.
You gotta eat the mic. Eat the mic.
Yeah, there you go.
One of the things we wanted to do was get down to see this communist country before they're all gone, because of course most of them have disappeared, since socialism is not a viable economic form of government, right? Justin tells me this.
I tell you, I'm sure. It's true.
So a lot of Che and Fidel Castro fans out there? No. So this isn't MoveOn.org, I meant, right? Well, we went down to Cuba, gosh, what was it, November, Debbie, and God, just had a great trip. We went on the eastern fifth of the country, so we kind of went to the back country. We didn't go to Havana. Erica did, who was here tonight, who we were just talking with back there. She had very interesting stories also. But I just wrote down some things I'll talk about. I just made some notes of things that happened down there. And things to remember: Cuba, which prior to 1959, when the revolution was one of the wealthier countries in the Western Hemisphere. Today, the average monthly salary is $20 a month. So you get some idea of how the people lived. And talking about the ration books, I've got a little story on that too. And Erica brought a ration book. She had to stuff it down her pants real quick to get it out of Cuba, is what she was just telling me, but it worked. So, one of the things we found on the eastern side was that since it's illegal, of course, for Americans to go to Cuba unless you're, we had to sign up to be a people-to-people ambassador and learn what we had to do as a people-to-people ambassador and claim that we weren't tourists and yada, yada, yada. So you can get in, but they don't see Americans. And I was walking out of a bathroom up on the north coast of Cuba on the eastern side, and they have bathroom attendants there, which is fairly common in Europe also, but they have bathroom attendants. And one of the things I like to do in those countries is carry a lot of $1 American bills, because I think it spreads a lot of goodwill. So I gave her, and she had a little tip jar there, and I put an American dollar bill in it, and I don't think she'd ever seen an American dollar bill. And she looked at me and she said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from the United States." And she says, "Oh, you're English." And I said, "No, I'm from the United States." And she said, "Do you mean Canada?" Wow. She'd clearly never seen an American. And I said, "No, I'm actually from the United States." This is the honest to God truth. She says, "So Germany?" Went one more round and she asked me if I was from Romania. Till finally I told her I was from Colorado and asked her if she'd ever heard of Colorado, and she hadn't. But that just tells you how foreign Americans were in that part of the country. Another person I ran across in a similar situation, when I finally convinced this person that I was in fact from the United States, the person looked at me and said, "Oh, okay, so Washington, D.C. or New York?" Clearly the two things they'd heard about. But since Justin started talking about the ration card that Erica is carrying, we didn't have one, but we saw a ration card down there. And it was interesting because that you go to a government commissary to get your rations. That was one of the first things that we found out when we got down. There's no stores in Cuba, or at least not stores as we know them. There's government commissaries. And then you have this ration card, and the powers to be, they know, the central planning committees, they know exactly how many eggs you should have every month, and exactly how many strands of spaghetti you should have, and how many, and so on and so forth. They know all this stuff about you. So it's really great on these guys' part to know all this stuff. But when I read down this ration card that one of the guides named Jesus showed me, I looked at it and I said, "Well, I'm going down this thing." I said, "Well, how come it says 0 this month?" And this was November. I said, "How come it says 0 for spaghetti?" And he looked at me and says, "We don't have spaghetti this month."
This month?
This month, yeah.
As an Italian, I'm offended.
The thought just hadn't occurred to me, and I went, "Oh, yeah, obviously it's going to be 0 if you don't have any." And as I looked back over his year-long ration card, there were zeros sporadically all the way through. So even the very basics, which you have to go and get at a government commissary, they have rolling shortages of them because, you know, they just can't produce them. We were talking with these fishermen one day. In the last few years, since Fidel has really given up power, ceded power because of his poor health to his brother Raul, they have started to allow some minor capitalistic reforms. For instance, you can now own a small restaurant, or you can even own a small farm, as long as you don't have more than 12 cows. And that's the breakoff point. If you own more than 12 cows, then it's illegal. You still can't own any sort of a restaurant or any sort of a motel, which, Erica, you were telling me you stayed through Airbnb, so, you know, that's interesting. I'm not sure how all that's working, but so they now also have some small grocery stores. And the grocery stores, once again, I was asking Jesus, our Cuban guide, I said, so how do these grocery stores work? Can you just go and buy something there? And he says, yeah. And I said, well, how do the prices compare with the government commissary? He says, well, they're cheaper. And I said, well, Jesus, isn't this a problem? And he says, well, yeah, it is. He says, one of the things we need to get better at, we need to get better at producing more goods for a lower price. I really wanted to say, Jesus, you've got the wrong system. But not knowing how they enforce, you know, they don't have free speech laws, you know, so I was kind of careful what I said when I was, so I didn't say anything, but that's what I wanted to say. Jesus, it ain't going to work for you. You've been working at it for 60 years, and you still can't give them spaghetti this month. We did have a chance to go by Gitmo. And you have the Cuban, you know, the naval base down there, Guantanamo Naval Base. It's been there, oh my gosh, since, I don't know, maybe the 1930s or something. But I was actually a little bit surprised at the antipathy towards the United States for the base. I knew there was the antipathy for Gitmo itself, for the prison, but I didn't really understand there was that much antipathy for the base. We could get close enough that we could look at it binoculars, and when I asked if you can get any closer, he says it's landmines from here on out, so I don't think you want to go closer. So I took his word for it. One of the things I was discussing was the embargo. And of course this embargo is huge, and it's been in place since, well, since '61. I'm looking around, I'm one of the few people in here who remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis, I can see, but that was when my teacher sent us home during the Cuban Missile Crisis with a sheet to fill out. And when we left class, we had to fill the minute on the sheet that we left class. And when we got home, our parents had to sign the minute that we got home. And then you had to figure out how many minutes it would take you to get home. And I was growing up in Montana, which, you know, missiles, and I'm sure it's this way today, but a lot of the missiles were on ICBM pads up there because missiles actually go over the North Pole during the Cold War. They would go over the North Pole, so being right up in Montana on the Canadian border is where so many of them were placed. So Montana was definitely on the radar of were there to be a nuclear attack, which there very well might have been. But we had to make sure that everybody could get home within 20 minutes because that's how long you had before the bombs would fall. Now, what in the world difference it made, I don't know. But the adults all seemed, you know, pretty concerned with all this, so it kind of got my attention. But anyway, so the embargo occurred shortly after that from Cuba. And once again, talking with Jesus, and Jesus actually, he was a sharp guy. He taught American history and English. He was an American history professor and English professor, and he was our guide. So he was a sharp guy. He knew American history. He could talk Jefferson. He could talk Madison. He really was well informed all that stuff. But he was upset that the American people didn't like the Cubans. And I had to, Jesus, I said, really, this whole thing had nothing to do with Cuba. This was all between the United States and the Soviet Union. That's what this whole embargo is about. And he said, well, why was America so upset, and why won't they change their policies now? And I said, well, now, didn't the Cuban government, once again, I was very careful what I said. I didn't ever know who was going to be listening. I said, didn't the Cuban government expropriate the property of all the businesses, all the American businesses? And he said, yes, they did. And I said, well, have they offered to give any of it back? And he said, no. And I said, do you think this might be part of the problem? Well, yeah, he says, that might be part of the problem. But of course you have a lot more, because all the houses, all the people's houses were everything was expropriated, everything was taken over by the government. And when we were in Santiago, wasn't it Santiago where we went down and had lunch that day, in the old part of Santiago where there were all these beautiful old homes. And I was really curious to see them, because I'd always been told that the beautiful old homes in Moscow, for instance, after the revolution in 1917, that they had all been that they were being lived in by members of the Communist Party. And I was curious to see when we got to Cuba if that was going to be the case, especially when I know we were going to go to and drive through this nice part of Santiago. And it was really sad, because a few of the houses had been taken over by the government, and they served as the bureau of this or the bureau of that, but most of them were just falling apart. Beautiful old homes just falling down, literally falling apart. It was really sad to see. So there's obviously no private enterprise, and there's no production going on. There's no way for them to have money to keep these beautiful homes. They're constantly reminding us of their free health care down there. And of course we all know the Michael Moore story and how he lets us know how great the health care is down there. I had, unfortunately, for the first time in my life, a toothache, and it kept getting worse and worse. And I was terrified of what was going to happen if I had to go to the hospital or a doctor's office. We had, like, every province has a doctor's office in it, and anyone can go to this doctor's office, and it is free. But I don't think you'd want to walk in. I mean, these places were like little hovels where they would have a doctor, and, you know, presumably, you know what he was doing. But I also found out that Michael Moore's story about how generous the Cuban people are in terms of going out in the world and sending their doctors out to help care for the poor in Africa and so on and so forth. Talking with a doctor down there, I was asking him about that. And he says, well, that's not quite how it works. He says, what really happens, he says, is that these foreign governments pay our interns to come take care of their people. He says, this way, we don't have to pay our interns to learn how to practice on people. He says, that's what's really going on with all this. And he didn't say it in any way apologetically, or anything. He was just informing me how it worked. It made sense to him. You know, Cuba doesn't have to pay for it, somebody else has to pay for it. So a lot of these stories you hear simply aren't, you know, what they appear to be. You can't buy Advil down there. You can't buy Tylenol. You can't buy anything. There's...
Not even spaghetti.
Not even spaghetti.
What the hell is wrong with this place?
So I went into a government drugstore when we were actually in the town of Guantanamo. I went into a government drugstore, and mostly it was just home remedies. And it looked like, for any of you, you don't remember Bonanza either, but Bonanza, it looked like 1850. People will constantly ask me about the cars, for instance. They'll say, is it like the 50s down there? I said, it's like the 1850s down there. They have nothing. You get outside of just maybe Havana and Santiago, there's no electricity. There's nothing. It is... We went to a cocoa bean plantation, which was really interesting. And once again, it was private. They're allowing some private cocoa bean plantations. And there were these cocoa beans being dried in old, what looked like sluice boxes that you might see in an old mining town like Breckenridge or something. They would dry them in there, they'd put them on the ground, they had rakes, they would rake out all the beans. And, you know, it was just interesting. It literally looked like 1850. So I asked the owner, I said, so what do you do with all the beans? You know, what happens with these beans? Do you own them now? You own your own business. He says, yes, and he was very proud of that he owned his own business. And I said, well, how do you know how much to sell your product for? Because this always fascinated me, you know, Justin, how in the world you can determine a price in a communist country, because really you can't. There's no way to do it, and that's their ultimate downfall.
Resource allocation.
Yeah.
So he said, well, here's what happens. At the beginning of the season, the government sends in someone, and I have to sign a contract with them. And the contract says that I have to sell 85% of my entire cocoa bean production to them. He says, and it's at a very low price. And I'll tell you what, if it's at a very low price on that standard of living, it's nothing. He's selling 85% of the products that he's raking out by hand on the ground. He's selling the stuff for nothing. But what the government then can do, they can go sell that to Belgium on the open market for a full price. That's what's funding the government. That's where they're getting their money. Is he sells it for a penny, they sell it for $10. But he is required to sell 85% of his product. I said, what do you do with the other 15%? He says, I go into town, I sell it. Who buys it? I said, who can buy it? He says, well, I'll go to the restaurants, some of them buy it. He says, I'll go to some of the private grocery stores, they'll buy it. He was very excited about it. So he actually got to keep 15% of his production, which is a huge step forward for them, and they were very excited. We visited Castro's birthplace, and it was interesting. I never realized that Castro had come from a very wealthy family. One of his next door neighbors that would have been in the same social circles with his parents were the Batistas. For those of you who...
The one that he deposed?
Yes.
What?
I saw Godfather
Yes.
2. Right.
Pardon me?
Godfather 2 dealt with that.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that. Okay. Well, Batista and Castro were neighbors. The Batistas and the Castros, and they were quite wealthy, both of them. And yeah, Batista is the one he overthrew.
His high school buddy.
Were they? Yeah, I don't think so.
that.
I'm not sure they knew each other, but their parents would have. Their parents would have had to, because there would have only been a few landowners that large in Cuba at the time. And then we went to some other places that were just interesting. We went to Baracoa. What was it, Debbie? Baracoa, where Columbus had landed. And, you know, that kind of stuff was just interesting historical stuff to work for. Then we spent some time at one of the universities. And 3 students and 3 or 4 teachers and the administrator were all in this discussion group, and it was actually a lot of fun. So I was asking the students, so how does it work in Cuba? How do you get in? How do you get into the university? He said, well, we take tests. I said, okay, that's pretty normal. I said, do you get to major in anything you want to? They said, no, not really. They said, what we do is we write down in order 1 through 5 the things that we want to study. And then the Central Planning Committee people who, once again, they know exactly what you should be studying and so on and so forth, they have that stuff down. They tell the university, well, 4 years from now we need to graduate this many teachers, this many engineers, this many doctors, and then they match up your preference with what the edicts coming down from the higher-ups in Havana tell them. And I said, well, what happens if you get into it and you don't like it? Can you change your major? And they said, not really. You have to, whatever you sign up for, you have to major in that, and then you have to work for several years for the government afterwards. And then you can, and then after that, you have the ability to go around and change some of the, you know, the work you do. So I asked the administrator, the head of the school, the head of the university. I asked her, now, I said, who is it in the government that tells you these things? Who tells you how many of each particular area of study you have to produce? I said, who is it that tells you? And she looked at me, and I don't think she'd ever thought of the question. And she says, I don't know. And I said, well, there's got to be somebody who's telling you these things. And so she left for 2 or 3 minutes, and she came back, and there was a group of 4 or 5 of them who sat around and discussed the question for a while. And finally she says, well, she says, the government in Havana tells us who has to major in what. And I said, do they have names? Do you know who these people are? And she said, then she discussed it with all the other people. Nobody actually knew who the people were. But she just finally said it's the Central Planning Committee. So they're just, you know, faceless bureaucrats who are telling everybody what they have to major in. And they think it's going to work, apparently. Hadn't done very well. I would say one thing that was interesting is I didn't find the people to be unhappy. I found the people to be very inviting. They liked seeing Americans. Of course, they hadn't seen many, but they liked seeing Americans and seemed, you know, very interested and very welcoming. So, anyway, I'm sitting and chat about things forever, but I think probably my time's up. So anyone got any questions? Or